Welcome. Today we are going to be covering something known as surface area to volume ratios. This is very important in determining the size and efficiency of cells. So what I have up on the screen, we'll talk more about it in Biology 20. This is the inside of the small intestine, and these things are called villi, and they line the entire surface area of the entire small intestine. And what they do is they help to increase the ability for your body to absorb nutrients. So what you'll notice here is that there's lots of surface for food molecules to be absorbed, right? Rather than if this was just a flat sheet, here we have all these nooks and crannies. So increasing surface area means that what you're doing is you're increasing the surface for particles to be absorbed or waste products to be ejected out of the cell, which makes it more efficient. So remember, we talked about this, that the cell is an open system. Now, what an open system means is that the cell exchanges both energy and matter with the world around it. And that goes for both in and out, right? So um, energy comes in. If you're a plant cell, that's solar energy. If you're an animal cell, that would be chemical energy. Energy goes out, usually heat. And then things like oxygen gas, water, nutrients, okay, that sort of thing needs to come in, and then carbon dioxide and waste products need to leave. Now, the size of the cell can affect how efficient these materials can go in and out. So here we have giant sequoia trees or redwoods. Here we have the largest organism to ever live, bigger than any dinosaur. That's the blue whale. You can see in relation to this boat how enormous this whale is. And then here we have this little paramecium. Okay, and this paramecium is microscopic and it's made of one cell. What do all these organisms have in common? They're all made of microscopic cells or a cell. The cell size in this single cell, okay, tiny little organism, or this gigantic blue whale, or this even bigger redwood tree, the cells of each of these organisms are roughly the same size. Okay, so what do the cells of all these organisms have in common? They're all microscopic. So even gigantic organisms still have tiny, tiny little cells. And the reason for that has to do with that efficiency of exchanging energy and materials. Now, mathematically, we can see this. As a cell becomes larger and larger, its volume increases. Okay, so remember, volume is measured in cubic millimeters, cubic centimeters, which corresponds to milliliters and liters. Okay, but it's a relationship that's cubed. Okay, so what that means is we have to take into account both, the height, the length, and the depth here. So the bigger the volume gets, the more space that an object takes up. And if you're a food particle and you're on the outside of the cell, it's going to take a lot longer to get to the middle of a cell if the cell has more volume, right? It's going to take a lot longer for this food particle right here to reach the center than it is for this food particle to reach the center of this cell. So the larger a cell gets, the bigger its volume gets, and the more cytoplasm it has. Now, take into consideration now surface area. Surface area is a squared relationship. Okay, so what that means is if volume is cubed, right, length times width times height, whereas surface area just takes into account the surface. It's squared, right? It's length times width times the number of sides. The volume gets bigger faster than the surface area. So that means that the bigger the cell gets, its volume is increasing quicker than its surface area, meaning you have more cytoplasm but less membrane to exchange materials through. Okay, so really important point here. Okay, you want to highlight this in your notes, make a point of it. As the size of a cell increases, the volume of the cell increases faster than the surface area. And this is because, as I mentioned, volume is a cubed function and surface area is only a squared function. Okay, so your volume is getting larger, so is your surface area as the cell gets bigger, but the volume increases faster than the surface area. And this causes problems when we're dealing with the exchange of materials, right? Because surface area means there's more cell membrane for exchange. Now we can calculate the surface area to volume ratio quite simply. Okay, the surface area to volume ratio just equals the total surface area divided by the total volume. Okay, and this gives us a whole number. Now, the larger the number, the more efficient a cell is. Okay, so the smaller a cell is going to give us a larger surface area to volume ratio. Okay, so again, you might want to highlight this in your notes. Okay, the larger a cell becomes, the smaller the surface area to volume ratio becomes. Conversely, the smaller a cell, the larger the surface area to volume ratio. Okay, so we want a big number here. The bigger the number, the better, the more efficient. Now, this is in your data booklet. You do not have to memorize this formula. You can find it in your data booklet on the very last page under Unit C. Okay, so like all formulas that we've talked about in Science 10, you do not have to memorize this. Okay, what you do have to memorize is that the smaller the cell, the larger the surface area to volume ratio. So the bigger this number, the better. So here we have a number of cubes. Okay, so here we have a cube that is that's 2 centimeters on each of its sides. Okay, so this would be a 2 by 2 by 2, right? And so on and so forth. You can see that the cubes get bigger, right? But take a look at their surface area. So the surface area is getting larger. The volume is also getting larger, but what about the surface area to volume ratios? So we just divide surface area by volume, okay, and we get these numbers. So if you'll notice, the smallest of these cubes has the largest surface area to volume ratio of a 3 here. Okay, the largest of the cubes, okay, which is 8 centimeters on each side. So this is 8, this is 8, this is 8, right? It's 4 times larger than the smallest cell, but look at the surface area to volume ratio. It's much smaller. Okay, this means less efficient, right? There's more volume compared to the surface area. Now, because of this, cells are limited in their size. Okay, so because of surface area to volume ratio and efficiency, cells are limited on how big they can get. This is why a blue whale or a giant, a giant redwood all have microscopic cells, because the smaller the cell, the more efficient. Now, if you want a bigger organism, the cells don't grow bigger, okay? They just grow more numerous. So a little tiny mouse and a gigantic blue whale, their cells are the same size. It's just the blue whale has way, way more of them. Okay, so large organisms are made up of many, 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 many microscopic cells. And this keeps the efficiency. So by having an organism made up of little cells, each cell is very efficient. And the entire organism is also very efficient because it's made up of these little cells. Now we see in nature, throughout nature, whether it's plants or animals, we see this idea of structures being made up of smaller substructures. So I mentioned the small intestine. This right here is a picture of the small intestine. Notice all these little, they're called villi, these little finger-like projections. Okay, you guys are probably too young to remember, but there's a type of carpeting that was really popular in the 70s. It was called shag carpet, and it looked like the small intestine. Okay, look at the root hairs here. Instead of having one large root like this, right here we have a large root. Here we have a root that's covered in these little tiny root hairs. Okay, these are called root hairs. This plant right here is way more efficient at absorbing water and nutrients because each of these hairs gives us way more surface area than just a smooth surface. The lungs are also made, they're not two big balloons, they're actually made up of millions and millions of tiny microscopic little air sacs. And this again makes them extremely efficient at absorbing oxygen and getting rid of carbon dioxide. Okay, and these little tiny sacs in the lungs are called alveoli. So in many different places in the natural world, we see these little extensions from structures, or we see structures made up of little tiny units because the smaller, the more efficient because of that surface area to volume ratio.
In this video, we're going to use one concept, surface area to volume ratio, to explain why cells are small, why whales are big, why elephants have big ears, why flatworms have no special system for moving oxygen into their cells, and why when you get cold, you hold your arms against your body. One concept to explain them all. Let's start with a demonstration. This block is made of agar, a seaweed extract, a bit of the base sodium hydroxide, and a pH indicator. This pH indicator, phenolphthalein, is this very nice fuchsia color when it's exposed to a base, and it turns clear when the pH turns acidic. I've cut cubes of this agar into 4 different sizes. The biggest is 3 centimeters on a side, the others are 2, 1, and 0.5 centimeters on a side. I'm going to put these cubes into a dish of vinegar, a weak acid. Watch what happens. In 6 minutes, the tiny cube has lost its fuchsia color and turned completely white. The other cubes still have some fuchsia inside, and the percentage that's still fuchsia goes up with the size of each cube. In other words, vinegar diffused into 100% of the smallest cube's volume, while it reached only 19% of the largest cube's volume. Let's get our heads around what's really going on. Diffusion is the movement of molecules in a fluid, a gas, or a liquid from where they're more concentrated or bunched up to where they're more spread out. It's how this drop of food coloring is spreading throughout this flask. You don't have to stir or add energy. The random movement of the food coloring molecules will lead them over time to move apart from one another. When we put our agar cubes in the vinegar is more concentrated outside the cubes than it is inside. So because there's nothing from stopping the vinegar from moving in, the vinegar diffuses from where it is, outside the cubes, to where it isn't, inside the cubes. The vinegar is diffusing through the outer surface of each cube, and we can quantify the amount of surface by measuring the surface area of each cube. In this table, I'm going to list the surface area for each of the 4 cubes, plus 3 imaginary ones. One smaller, 0.1 centimeters on a side, and 2 bigger, 5 centimeters on a side, and 10 centimeters on a side. The vinegar is diffusing through the outer surface and into the cube's volume. The smallest cube has the smallest volume at 0.001 centimeters cubed, while the largest cube has the largest volume, 1,000 centimeters cubed. What we're concerned with is the ratio of surface area to volume. A ratio is the relationship between 2 numbers, and the ratio we want is the ratio between the surface area for each cube divided by its volume. So in our tiny imaginary cube, 0.1 centimeters on a side, the surface area to volume ratio is 60 to 1. In the largest cube that we're considering, 10 centimeters on a side, the ratio is 100 times less. 0.6 to 1. The smaller a cube is, the larger its ratio of surface area to volume. And conversely, the larger a cube is, the smaller its ratio of surface area to volume. In other words, the larger something is, the less surface area it has relative to its volume. And that's why cells are small. Cells, to stay alive, have to exchange materials with their environment. For most cells, that means that things like oxygen and food need to go in, and carbon dioxide and other wastes need to come out. That exchange is largely by diffusion. If cells were too big, then diffusion wouldn't work in terms of reaching the entire volume of the cell. Just pretend that the smallest agar cube was a cell, and that the vinegar molecules were oxygen. This cell is doing fine. Oxygen is getting all the way deep into the cell. Things are diffusing in and out. This cell is well adapted to exchange substances with its environment through diffusion. But if these larger cubes were also cells, they'd be having a hard time. Whatever needs to get in isn't getting in very far. A lot of this poor cell would be suffocating and filling up with waste that can't diffuse out. Tininess gives cells a very high surface area to volume ratio, and that's why cells are small. All right, so what's with the flat ears on the elephants? Well, elephants are mammals just like we are, and like us, they maintain a constantly high body temperature. We mammals like our cells to be warm, but too warm is dangerous because excessive heat can reduce enzyme function by denaturing enzymes. That can kill you. Because elephants are big, their bodies have very little surface area relative to their enormous volume. And this makes it very difficult for heat to diffuse out of the elephant's body. So think about this in terms of the long, slow process of evolution. As the ancestors of elephants evolved to grow bigger, they needed other adaptations to improve their ability to allow heat to diffuse out of their bodies. And that's what the elephant's huge ears do. In the thin flap of skin that makes up each ear, blood can circulate, and the heat in that blood, being close to the surface, can diffuse out of the elephant's body. That's the adaptation, a flat sheet of tissue that makes heat diffusion easier. To simulate this, let's cut a flat sheet of our phenolphthalein agar and put that in vinegar. Because it's flat, this flat sheet has a very high surface area to volume ratio. So it's very easy for the vinegar to reach the entire volume of this sheet in a relatively short time. Summary: big flat appendages with their high surface area to volume ratio are often adaptations for radiating heat into the environment. And how about this flatworm? No heart, no lungs. How is oxygen getting to all of its cells? How is carbon dioxide getting out? Because these animals are flat, they have a very high surface area to volume ratio. So you can assume that oxygen just diffuses from the surrounding water in, and carbon dioxide from the body cells out. And what about the huge size of whales? For whales, who often live in cold water, the problem is the opposite of the problem that elephants face. Elephants have to deal with overheating. Whales have to struggle with hypothermia, with heat loss. So think about the fact that in water that's a nice 80 degrees, a human being can become hypothermic within a couple of hours. How do whales survive lifelong immersion in ocean water? Size is a big part of how whales adapted to the cold stress involved in living in water. Whales are huge. Huge things, just by the math, have a very low surface area to volume ratio. That means that the heat inside a whale's body is effectively trapped inside. There's no way for it to get out. Remember our cubes. Large size is bad for diffusion. So just by evolving large size, whales decreased their surface area to volume ratio. This made it easier for them to maintain their body temperature. It was a selective advantage. Genes for size got passed on because of surface area to volume considerations. You know, I'm filming this in early winter, and it just got pretty cold here in California. Oh my goodness, look at what I did. I'm holding my arms against my body. By doing that, I'm effectively decreasing my surface area while, of course, keeping my volume the same. holy cow, that means that this is a behavioral adaptation for decreasing my surface area to volume ratio, preventing diffusion of heat. And what about this? These ridges of tissue are the villi of the small intestine. Their job, absorbing food from the gut into the bloodstream. Why do you think they have this wavy shape? Because a wavy surface increases surface area to volume ratios. To demonstrate this, I cut a piece of agar to very roughly the shape of the villi of the small intestine. All of these ridges have the effect of increasing the surface area to volume ratio. As a result, diffusion happens more easily, and you can absorb the food that you need to absorb from your gut into your blood. We've seen in this video how important surface area to volume ratios are, how increasing the ratio of surface area to volume makes diffusion easier, leading to adaptations like big ears in elephants or the flat shape of flatworms and wavy tissues. We've also seen how decreasing the ratio of surface area to volume makes diffusion harder, leading to adaptations like folded arms against our body or evolving to great size if you're a whale.
Okay, so if you take a look in your note package, you'll notice on page 31, there are a number of questions. I would like you to please make sure and read your textbook as well as work on the questions on page 31 of your note package.